Thousands of military decisions during the Second World War were based on false information created by a single man. Non-existent reports, networks of agents who never lived, and precisely fabricated data altered the reaction of the German High Command at critical moments of the conflict. For years, Germany relied on a source that did not exist outside of paper. The deception took shape through a Spanish citizen without advanced military training and with no prior experience in intelligence. His limited access, ordinary life, and lack of background made him an unlikely candidate for any strategic operation. However, his ability to generate plausible information, maintain fictitious identities, and understand surveillance mechanisms allowed for the construction of a structure that diverted troops, influenced decisions, and altered the development of entire campaigns. The Allied system leveraged that skill to turn it into a tool of war. How did this unprecedented operation originate? What allowed an unknown individual to manipulate a military power? How was the deception maintained for years without being discovered? Origins of deception, the rise of an improbable actor. The life path of Juan Pujol Garcia begins on February 14, 1912, in a Barcelona that was experiencing a sustained urban transformation under the political system of the Restoration. The city combined industrial expansion with continuous demographic growth driven by the consolidation of textile, metallurgical, and commercial companies that placed Catalonia among the most dynamic regions of Spain. In this environment, Juan was born, the third of four siblings in the home of Joan Pujol Pena and Mercedes Garcia Guijarro. The father ran a dye factory for the textile industry, an activity that provided a stable economic position. The mother came from Motril in Granada and brought to the family core a deeply rooted religious tradition that was manifested in the daily routine, although the ideological orientation of the home was mainly marked by the liberal thinking of the father, who advocated open political forms against the extremist discourses that were beginning to gain strength in different European regions. The place where the early years of Juan took place was an apartment located in the example of Barcelona, an area designed by Ildefons Cerdà with wide streets and regular blocks that housed families linked to industrial and commercial activities. The home allowed for a level of comfort typical of the middle bourgeoisie, although without ostentation. There were domestic employees, access to private education, and economic stability, but the lifestyle was maintained within prudent margins. Religious discipline was part of the family routine, with Sunday masses and devotional practices, a common expression in many households of the time. Juan participated in these activities as part of the family environment, without it essentially defining his identity, in a country where the Catholic tradition remained a structural element of public and private life. At 7 years old, he was enrolled in the Valdemia boarding school in Mataró, run by the Marist brothers. The center combined academic teaching with rigid discipline and a system of life regulated by strict schedules. The days began with prayers, continued with classes in mathematics, Latin, history, and geography, and closed with supervised study. Outings were regulated and depended on family visits, allowing his father to maintain regular contact through weekly trips from Barcelona. During the 4 years he remained there, Juan adapted to the demands of the center without particularly excelling in any subject. The prolonged coexistence in a hierarchical school environment allowed him to recognize behavior patterns, identify stricter teachers, and anticipate reactions in disciplinary situations, common elements in the internal life of religiously oriented educational institutions. In 1923, he was transferred to a school in Barcelona, run by a priest known to the family. That change placed him once again in the urban dynamic during a period marked by the establishment of the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera, who had eliminated political freedoms and reorganized the public administration. The new school offered religious education and a less strict discipline than that of the previous boarding school. 3 years later, a conflict with a teacher motivated his definitive departure from the formal school system. The lack of precise documentation precludes knowing the exact nature of the incident, but its direct consequence was his entry as an apprentice in a hardware store in the Gracia neighborhood in 1927, when Barcelona was experiencing visible labor tensions related to episodes of strikes, protests, and the presence of anarchist groups. The hardware store served workers, artisans, and small merchants who purchased tools and materials for everyday activities. That continuous contact with a diverse clientele allowed him to directly observe the social conditions of a neighborhood with a strong working-class identity. Conversations about wages, labor conflicts, and political opinions were part of the everyday environment in the establishment. Without participating in those discussions, Juan acquired practical knowledge of the tensions that characterized the Barcelona labor world during the 1920s, a period known for the violent actions of union groups and the repressive response of organized employer sectors. In 1929, he decided to undertake technical training at the Royal Poultry School of Arenys de Mar, a leading institution in the teaching of breeding, feeding, and management techniques for poultry farms. The training included theoretical content on anatomy, nutrition, and animal health, complemented with practical exercises in facilities aimed at studying the necessary conditions to maintain stable production. The diploma obtained awarded him specific training in an agricultural sector undergoing modernization, where the increase in urban demand for food products promoted the professionalization of farms and operations. In 1931, he completed compulsory military service through the quota system, which allowed the reduction of the service duration to 6 months. He was assigned to the 7th Light Artillery Regiment, a unit with its structure based on traditional cavalry. The Spanish army then operated under a rigid disciplinary scheme with strict orders, standardized exercises, and clear hierarchies. The experience was short and did not create lasting ties with the military institution, as happened with numerous young people who fulfilled the service solely due to legal obligation. That same year saw the proclamation of the Second Republic, which replaced the monarchy after municipal elections had awarded significant victories to Republican candidates in several cities. The regime change prompted educational, labor, and administrative reforms. A few months later, the sudden death of the father forced a reorganization of the management of the family factory, which passed into the hands of trusted employees. Economic stability was maintained, although the absence of the principal figure of the business altered the internal structure of the company. The death also represented a change for Juan, who began taking jobs in small urban businesses during the years immediately following. During that stage, he worked in a cinema that operated with regular screenings at a time when the film industry was beginning to expand in Spain, thanks to the introduction of sound and the increase in audiences. The job included supervisory functions, schedule control, and basic income management. He also participated in the administration of a small hotel, similar to the guest houses that in those years catered to merchants, travelers, and temporary workers. The management of establishments of this type required organization of reservations, coordination with employees, and attention to diverse clients, functions that were part of the service economy in a city that maintained sustained growth. In the mid-30s, he decided to focus on running a poultry farm located north of Barcelona. There, he applied the knowledge he had acquired in Arenys de Mar through the management of bird feeding, health control, egg classification, and distribution to local markets. During that period, the poultry activity benefited from the constant demand for food products in urban areas, which allowed for maintaining a relatively stable level of income. The routine associated with farm operations involved planning, accounting records, and regular coordination with suppliers and buyers. The Spanish political situation during those years showed a progressive increase in ideological polarization. The general elections of 1933 had resulted in a right-wing government. Those of 1936 granted victory to the Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties. Tensions between labor and business organizations, legislative changes, and episodes of political violence occurring in various regions created an unstable environment. Barcelona, as the main industrial center of the country, visibly reflected these processes. Pujol did not participate in political activities, nor showed adherence to ideological groups, a common attitude in sectors dedicated to agricultural or commercial activities situated outside labor or party organizations. On the 18th of July of 1936, while preparing a planned excursion with a group of acquaintances, he heard on the radio the news of the military uprising initiated in the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco. The information available during the first few hours was fragmentary and evidenced the uncertainty typical of an ongoing coup d'état. In Barcelona, the forces loyal to the Republic, supported by workers' militias, resisted and defeated the rebels. In other regions, the insurrection was successful and led to an immediate territorial division. The dye factory that had belonged to his father came under worker control, as happened in numerous companies in the city. The poultry business ceased to be viable due to the economic reorganization imposed by the war, which affected supply, control of the territory, and the functioning of the markets. The outbreak of the conflict definitively transformed the environment in which Juan had lived and worked. The war would extend over 3 years and introduce structural changes that would alter civilian life, productive activities, and the administration of vast areas of the country. For him, the disruption of the previous order meant the end of his economic stability and the beginning of a period in which he would be forced to adapt to a political and social scenario completely different from what he had known up to that moment. The decisions he would make in the following years would lead him to unforeseen environments that would shape his later connection to large-scale international events. Spain in flames, the war that shattered all neutrality. On the 18th of July 1936, Barcelona recorded the first signs of the military uprising initiated in the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco. From the early hours of the morning, isolated gunshots in various parts of the city indicated that military units had attempted to support the coup. Radio stations broadcast fragmentary information about the situation in different regions: uprising in Seville, fighting in Madrid, military movements in Aragon. The city remained in a state of uncertainty as the Republican forces and worker militias organized to confront the insurgents. Juan Pujol, who was preparing for a previously planned excursion, returned to Barcelona to assess the magnitude of the events. During the afternoon, the main streets, such as the Ramblas and Via Laietana, came under the control of militiamen belonging to workers' organizations like the CNT-FAI and the PSUC. The rebel barracks were besieged and stormed during the day, and the Republican authorities declared control of the city after intense clashes. As the day progressed, fires broke out in religious temples, assaults on buildings linked to the church, and occupations of properties associated with sectors considered opposed to the Republic. These actions, also recorded in other Catalan towns, were part of the revolutionary process that accompanied the defeat of the military coup in Barcelona. During those hours, Juan noted that the political situation had changed irreversibly. In the following days, the Republican militias began mobilization processes to send contingents to the Aragon front. The industrial establishments had, in many cases, come under the control of workers' committees, which requisitioned facilities and bank accounts based on the needs of the conflict. The dye factory belonging to Juan's father was occupied under these provisions. His family was marked as belonging to a bourgeois environment, which generated coercive measures by revolutionary groups. His mother and his sister Elena were detained during a political control operation. They remained detained for several days while their link to bourgeois economic activities was verified. The intervention of a relative affiliated with a union facilitated their release, a practice that was repeated in various cases of people considered suspicious for ideological or social reasons. Faced with the risk of arrest, Juan decided to hide temporarily at his partner's home in Barcelona. He remained there for several weeks without going out in public. From inside the house, he observed through the balconies and windows the activity of armed patrols, the replacement of religious symbols with revolutionary propaganda, and the intensification of urban controls. The atmosphere in the city was unstable and characterized by authority distributed among various militias. The risk of arrest for not voluntarily presenting himself at the recruitment points increased with each passing day. This situation led Juan to limit his movements to what was strictly necessary. At the end of September of 1936, a raid organized by Republican militia members searched various properties in the neighborhood where he was hiding. During the operation, documents were found, and people who had not complied with mobilization orders were arrested. Juan was arrested and taken to a police station in Gracia. He remained for approximately 1 week in police custody, along with other detainees, awaiting his administrative classification. There he was questioned about his absence in the recruitment processes and about his work activity. He provided explanations based on supposed documentary irregularities, procedures that were common in a context of massive raids. During that period, a clandestine organization, White Aid, intervened in his situation. This group, active in Barcelona during the first months of the conflict, provided assistance to people considered at risk for religious or family reasons. A collaborator of the group, posing as a member of revolutionary militias, managed his release through a discreet operation during nighttime hours. The departure from the police station occurred without incident, and John was immediately transferred to an apartment in the Gothic quarter belonging to the wife of a militarized taxi driver. The place served as a refuge for persecuted individuals, in a city where surveillance was constant and clandestine networks played a significant role. He stayed on that floor for more than 1 year. The dwelling had a room intended for the refugees, who had to remain silent for most of the day to avoid arousing suspicion. The woman who managed the shelter delivered food at irregular times. The news came through the radio and allowed tracking the conflict's progress, stabilization of fronts, reorganization of the Republican Army, and entry into combat of international units. As the months passed, the prolonged confinement produced in Juan an observable physical deterioration, with weight loss and a significant reduction of mobility. These effects were common among people who stayed hidden for long periods in confined spaces. During 1937, Socorro Blanco worked to obtain false documentation for Juan. The objective was to obtain certificates that certified an age older than the real one, which would allow justifying that he was not subject to mandatory conscription. The falsified documentation, although rudimentary, was common in Barcelona at the time, where the volume of refugees and deserters made administrative controls difficult. By the middle of that year, the documents were completed, and Juan was able to leave the refuge. Thanks to those papers, he got a job on a poultry farm in Sant Joan de les Abadesses, an area where various properties had been requisitioned and collectivized according to the measures adopted by the Generalitat and the revolutionary committees. The farm operated under a system of collective management, with decisions made in workers' assemblies. This model generated delays in decision-making and made it difficult to implement technical measures. In several reports from the time, it is documented that collectivized agricultural farms showed declines in productivity due to the lack of coordination. The farm where Juan worked reflected these dynamics: health problems among the birds, a shortage of veterinary supplies, and ongoing debates about organizational priorities. In August of 1938, President Juan Negrin decreed an amnesty for fugitives and deserters in order to reorganize the Republican Army in the face of the advance of Francoist troops. This amnesty allowed thousands of men to regularize their situation. Juan decided to take advantage of this measure and presented himself at a recruitment center. Using his forged documentation, he declared technical experience in transmissions, a strategic claim that increased the chances of being assigned to units where individual mobility was greater. He was sent to the Ebro front at the end of September of 1938, where the most extensive offensive of the conflict was taking place. In that area, Republican units operated alongside international brigades. The front was experiencing intense combat, with massive use of artillery, machine guns, and aviation, as well as troop movements under conditions of extreme attrition. One was assigned to tasks related to communication lines and was deployed in positions close to the river. From those trenches, he observed the material effects of the battle: displacement of the wounded, constant movement of ammunition, destruction of structures, and the presence of lifeless bodies in areas close to the front. The Ebro offensive prolonged the war for months, despite the logistical difficulties and the accumulated attrition of the Republican army. During a night of clear moonlight, Juan attempted to leave the Republican lines along with 2 companions, taking advantage of a change of guard. This type of desertion was common at the end of the war, when numerous soldiers sought to cross into areas controlled by the insurgents. The attempt caused confusion and was detected by Republican units that opened fire. In the dash towards the enemy zone, one of his companions was hit. Juan continued advancing over irregular and partially lit terrain. As he approached the Francoist positions, he identified himself loudly and was captured by a patrol. The usual protocol involved questioning the deserters to confirm that they were not infiltrators. After his arrest, he was transferred to a prisoner camp near Deusto. In these facilities, captured Republican fighters or deserters were concentrated, applying classification procedures that included interrogations and document verification. The camps recorded difficult conditions, with overcrowding, reduced food supply, and constant presence of guards. Executions following summary trials were documented practices in different nationalist facilities during that period. Juan remained in the camp until a parish priest known to the family managed his release through certifications that proved family background not linked to Republican activism. Released at the end of 1938, he was transferred to Burgos, the seat of the Francoist government during much of the conflict. There he was assigned to minor administrative tasks, while the military advance toward Catalonia and Madrid continued. In Burgos, he met Araceli González Carballo, an official from Lugo, who worked in administrative offices. He established a relationship with her that would continue after the war. During those months, the Republican military situation deteriorated rapidly, especially after the fall of Catalonia in February of 1939. On the 1st of April of 1939, the official communiqué signed by Franco declared the military operations finished. Juan had passed through areas controlled by both sides and had been mobilized by the Republic and classified by the nationalists. After the war, he began the process to formalize his relationship with Araceli and organized his new life in a Spain under the absolute control of the Francoist regime. In the following months, international attention shifted towards Central Europe, where tensions between Germany and Poland anticipated a new continent-wide conflict. The experience accumulated by Juan during the Civil War, marked by arrests, concealments, forced displacements, and direct observation of political and military dynamics, would place him in a particular position when, months later, the Second World War began. Path to the Shadow, the decisive step towards the secret war. When the Civil War ended in April of 1939, Spain began a process of administrative and economic reorganization in a context marked by material destruction and the establishment of centralized political structures under the new regime. The Francoist authorities consolidated control of the ministries, reorganized justice through military tribunals, established a rationing system to regulate supply, and undertook reconstruction programs limited by a lack of resources. In that scenario, Juan Pujol moved to Burgos and later to Madrid after his discharge from the army. Like numerous demobilized citizens, he needed to find a means of subsistence in a capital whose economic activity had been drastically reduced. Juan moved to Madrid in the early months of 1940. The city showed visible signs of wear, damaged buildings, infrastructures pending repair, irregular transportation, and a domestic market affected by scarcity. The Franco administration had re-established civil and military authority, and political surveillance was intense. Amid this situation, Pujol completed the necessary procedures to establish residency in the capital. In April, he married Araceli González Carballo, a young woman of Galician origin with whom he had maintained contact since Burgos. The ceremony was held according to the prevailing ecclesiastical regulations, reinstated as the official reference following the end of the conflict. The couple rented a room in a pension in the center of Madrid, located on Gran Via. The material conditions were basic: small accommodation, functional furniture, and services subject to the usual limitations of rationing. The urban environment showed a mix of slow reconstruction and growing administrative activity. During the following months, Juan looked for a job and finally got one as a manager at the Hotel Majestic on Ayala Street. The position involved coordinating room service, supervising reservations, controlling inventories, and managing daily accounting. It was a stable job within the economic circumstances of the time. From his position in the hotel, Pujol observed the increase in German presence in Madrid during 1940. Diplomats, officials, technicians, and commercial representatives of the Third Reich frequently visited the capital. Spain maintained an officially non-belligerent stance, but the Francoist regime showed political and symbolic alignment with Germany and Italy. Economic agreements allowed exchanges of raw materials and strategic services, and it was common to see German officials in public spaces of the city. Hotel staff recorded their stays and managed their logistical needs. Meanwhile, the Spanish press, subjected to censorship, disseminated limited information about the development of the Second World War. The newspapers reproduced official German statements and offered partial summaries of military operations: the invasion of Poland in 1939, the campaigns in Denmark and Norway in April of 1940, the offensive on France between May and June of the same year, and the beginning of the air battle over the United Kingdom, starting in September. Although the content was filtered, it allowed following the progression of the conflict and the advance of German troops. In the summer of 1940, Juan began to receive shortwave transmissions coming from London. The practice was not uncommon among urban citizens with access to receivers. The BBC broadcasted news in Spanish with a more extensive informative structure than the Spanish press. Through those transmissions, details about military operations, nighttime bombings, and political speeches were known. The differences between the German version disseminated by the Francoist press and the British version were evident. The combination of both sources allowed the partial reconstruction of the development of the war. In early 1941, the couple's first child was born. Juan's economic situation continued to depend on the hotel salary, which guaranteed relative stability. During that period, he began to consider the possibility of intervening in the European war in some way. He did not have advanced military training nor diplomatic contacts, but he did have experience in the Civil War related to the use of false identities, complex administrative maneuvers, and situations where it was necessary to generate plausible explanations. These skills, developed in an environment of strict political control, constituted a set of practices that could be reused in different contexts. Towards the end of 1940, Juan decided to offer his services to the British Embassy. His approach was simple: to make available to the United Kingdom his knowledge of the Spanish environment and his ability to gather information in Madrid. He showed up without an appointment at the diplomatic headquarters, located on Fernando el Santo Street. Security procedures included waiting in monitored areas and brief interviews with mid-level staff. A consular officer listened to his proposal, took notes, and made no further commitment. The treatment was correct, but without signs of operational interest. In the months following, he returned 2 more times to the embassy. On each occasion, he presented variations of the same offer, highlighting his mobility throughout Spain, his knowledge of social networks, and his ability to observe potentially relevant activities related to Germany. He also presented his experience on both sides during the Civil War as an indication of adaptation to changing situations. The British diplomats maintained their initial stance. The embassy received numerous similar offers and classified most as non-viable due to the impossibility of verifying credentials. Additionally, Spain was formally neutral, but the Francoist authorities kept active surveillance of diplomatic missions. Recruiting a volunteer without references represented significant risks. After these failed attempts, Juan evaluated a different alternative. If he could not get in touch with the United Kingdom from the condition of volunteer, he could try to do so from the opposite position. to present himself to Germany as a collaborator willing to act in favor of the Axis. In that case, if he managed to be accepted by the Abwehr, he could later contact the British again from a completely different starting point. This approach involved adopting additional functional identities and constructing a narrative designed to appear plausible to the German intelligence services. In the spring of 1941, Juan presented himself at the German embassy in Madrid, located on Paseo de la Castellana. He requested an interview with staff responsible for security matters and expressed interest in collaborating with Germany. He stated that he had commercial connections that supposedly would allow him to travel easily to Portugal and from there to the United Kingdom. He pointed out that his position as a Spanish citizen gave him adequate cover to perform discreet tasks without raising suspicion. The embassy referred his case to the Abwehr, whose agents operated in Spain with diplomatic cover. After several preliminary meetings, the Abwehr decided to explore the possibility of using him as an agent. The officer assigned was Friedrich Knapper-Rete, known in Spain as Federico. Juan received basic training in espionage techniques tailored to agents without prior training, use of invisible ink prepared with simple chemical reagents, encryption by numerical substitution, security rules for written communications, and procedures for sending covert messages. The Abwehr gave him £600 as initial operating capital and a postal address in Lisbon to send letters written ostensibly as personal correspondence, but containing reports hidden under invisible ink. He was assigned an operational code name, Arabelle. The objective set by the Abwehr was for him to travel to the United Kingdom, establish a network of contacts, identify relevant military and civilian targets, and send periodic reports through the Portuguese postal system. In July of 1941, Juan traveled to Lisbon as agreed. However, once there, he did not continue his journey to the United Kingdom. Lisbon functioned then as a usual meeting point for agents of multiple nationalities. The city allowed access to foreign press, libraries, international commercial companies, and various diplomatic networks. Juan settled in a guest house in the Alfama neighborhood and began to prepare fictitious reports for the Abwehr. To produce the reports, he used open sources, British travel guides, urban and regional maps, transportation yearbooks, military dictionaries, and newspapers several days late imported into Portugal. With that material, he constructed detailed descriptions of convoy movements inferred from logical maritime routes, estimates on military activity deduced from map analysis, and references to civilian life taken from press articles. The reports were presented with enough factual density to be credible, mixing verifiable information from public sources with invented data that could not be immediately checked. Juan drafted the reports in invisible ink on letters addressed to the indicated post office box. Federico retrieved the envelopes and applied chemical reagents to reveal the hidden content. He later sent the information to Berlin. The Abwehr received the first reports with interest, although they contained minor contradictions, errors in measurements, geographical inaccuracies, or incorrect cultural references. They were accepted as the product of an operative agent in British territory. In 1941, Germany had notable difficulties in maintaining active networks in the United Kingdom, so Arabelle was considered a valuable resource. During the latter part of 1941 and the first months of 1942, Juan maintained a steady flow of reports, increasing the complexity of the narratives. He invented fictitious contacts, supposed trade routes, and plausible military movements. His reports were extensive, coherent, and regularly presented. The Abwehr, satisfied with the amount of information, continued to fund his activities through additional payments transferred to Lisbon. Arabelle thus became an agent whose productivity reinforced his credibility with Berlin. By the middle of 1942, Juan had already established a complete operational structure based exclusively on open sources and his ability to deduce plausible data. His initial success with the Abwehr created the necessary conditions for him to attempt once more to establish contact with the British. The fundamental difference from 1941 was his new position. He could now present himself as an active German agent with a code name, operational funds, and a fictitious network that the Germans considered real. The actions he would undertake from that point on would definitely alter his trajectory and place him on the threshold of the episode that would define his role in the Second World War. Entrance to the maze, the arrival at the Double Cross. On the 24th of April of 1942, Juan Pujol arrived at the port of Plymouth after a journey discreetly organized by MI6. He had left Lisbon using British documentation and was traveling accompanied by his wife Araceli and their young son. The transfer was carried out under strict controls, characteristic of a country that had been at war for almost 3 years. Although the intensity of the German bombings had decreased, British cities showed significant damage, destroyed railway stations, partially collapsed factories, and homes marked by recent impacts. Upon disembarking, Pujol was taken directly to London under the supervision of British officers specialised in internal security. During the 2 following weeks, he was subjected to a thorough verification process by MI5. The purpose was to check the consistency of his story, his origin, his activities in Lisbon, and his relationship with the Abwehr. The investigation included face-to-face interviews, analysis of documents provided by him, and cross-references with external information available in British and Portuguese archives. Among those responsible for his evaluation was Desmond Bristow, an MI6 officer with experience in operations carried out in the Iberian Peninsula. The sessions took place at MI5 facilities in London and followed a standard protocol: prolonged interviews, detailed review of his background in Spain, analysis of the type of information he had given to the Germans, and assessment of its potential usefulness. After completing the preliminary verification, MI5 concluded that Pujol was a viable candidate to join the British counter-espionage system. The Double Cross system, managed by the 20 Committee, had succeeded in the early years of the war in controlling the majority of the agents sent by Germany to the United Kingdom. The methodology consisted of capturing or identifying the Abwehr spies and offering them to collaborate under British supervision. Once turned into double agents, they sent carefully selected information to their handlers in Germany. The main objective was to influence German strategic perceptions, reducing their ability to accurately interpret British military movements. The Pujol case differed from the others because he had not been captured. He had acted on his own initiative in Lisbon, sending fictitious reports to the Abwehr and establishing a functional identity as an operative agent in England. This unprecedented circumstance made his entry into the system a priority matter for MI5. His credibility with the Abwehr was consolidated, and his position could be used to develop operations of greater scope. Upon formally joining the Double Cross system, he was assigned a new British codename. The first proposed code was Bovril, but it was soon discarded. Finally, Garbo was chosen, in reference to the prestige associated with the Swedish actress Greta Garbo. The name was intended to reflect the interpretative ability that Pujol had demonstrated in Lisbon. The officer assigned as the principal in charge of his case was Thomas Harris, a member of MI5 fluent in Spanish and experienced in cultural affairs related to Spain. Harris and Pujol began to work together from the very beginning. To ensure their safety, MI5 housed the family in Hendon, in the north of London. They lived in a modest house that did not arouse suspicion among the neighbours. The area had basic services, bus transportation, and easy access to the centre of London. A second house on the same street was set up as an operational office. Communication equipment, including transmitters and receivers, was installed there by an MI5 technician, Charles Haynes. The separation between home and work centre was due to security reasons, as it allowed undercover activity to be kept away from possible external observations. The work of Garbo was organised following a precise routine. Each morning, Pujol went to the operational house, accompanied by Harris. In a room on the upper floor, they reviewed instructions from the 20 Committee related to the disinformation needs of the moment. The guidelines included which real data could be sent without risk, which fictitious data should be introduced, and which topics should be avoided to not compromise military operations. The goal was not to provide indiscriminate false information, but to build a coherent information flow that the Abwehr could consider reliable. A central aspect of the work was the expansion and formalization of the fictitious sub-agent network initially devised by Pujol in Lisbon. There he had improvised some identities without a defined structure. Now, with the support of MI5, the network was developed systematically. Each imaginary sub-agent received a complete profile: name, age, profession, usual places of activity, level of access to information, operational limitations, and personal background. These profiles were documented internally and used to build coherent narratives in the reports sent to the Abwehr. Harris and Pujol created more than 20 fictional identities. Some were linked to civilian sectors such as commerce or transportation. Others were part of British military structures, though always in secondary positions to avoid inconsistencies with real personnel. The complexity of the network allowed for reports to be issued from multiple sources, which increased the overall credibility. Additionally, internal dynamics were introduced: rivalries, temporary unavailability of certain agents, communication problems, or relocations. These details added plausibility as they reflected common situations in real intelligence networks. To reinforce the authenticity of the reports, MI5 organized punctual trips for Pujol to British cities where his sub-agents supposedly operated. During these visits, local details such as street names, transport schedules, restaurant menus, product prices, and regional newspaper headlines were collected. Subsequently, those elements were incorporated into the reports of the fictitious network. In this way, the messages sent to Spain contained precise details that German officers could verify by independent means, thereby reinforcing Garbo's credibility. The reports were initially transmitted by letter using the post office box in Lisbon, maintained by the Abwehr. The letters contained messages written with invisible ink, formulated according to the instructions previously provided by Frederick, the German officer who had acted as a liaison. The invisible ink allowed the content to go unnoticed in superficial inspections. MI5 supervised each letter before sending it to ensure that the material did not reveal sensitive information for the British. Starting from August of 1943, the system moved towards wireless transmissions. To justify this change to the Abwehr, Pujol constructed the narrative that he had recruited a radio operator within his network. This fictitious operator allowed sending messages faster and more frequently. In reality, the transmissions were carried out by Haynes from the operational house in Hendon. The change in method increased the effectiveness of the work, as the radio allowed communication of data without relying on the Portuguese mail. The Germans accepted the explanation without objections. The most effective method used by the 20 Committee was combining truthful information of low value with strategic disinformation. When the real information did not compromise military operations, its delivery was authorized to maintain Garbo's reputation. At the same time, false data was introduced to divert German attention from real targets. This technique was applied in operations of tactical and strategic scope. The most significant example before 1944 was Operation Torch, the Allied landing in North Africa in November 1942. For Torch, MI5 allowed Garbo to send partially accurate information about the movement of a convoy. The message was prepared before the landing, but its delivery was deliberately delayed so that the information reached the Abwehr when it could no longer be used to take defensive measures. The letter bore an authentic postmark, which allowed it to be shown that it had been sent in advance. Berlin interpreted the delay as a postal problem, not as a British maneuver. After receiving the report, the Germans congratulated Garbo on the quality of his work. The success of this operation demonstrated that controlled disinformation could have a significant effect on the enemy's strategic perception. By the end of 1942 and during 1943, the amount of information that Garbo sent increased considerably. He drafted hundreds of reports describing, in detail, actions supposedly observed in numerous British cities. They included references to troop movements, military exercises, overheard comments, rumors in ports, and estimates on industrial production. Although most of this data was fabricated, it was formulated consistently with open sources and MI5 instructions. Berlin classified the reports as reliable and incorporated them into internal studies. This perception led the Abwehr to dedicate increasing resources to monitoring the fictitious network. On the administrative level, MI5 channeled funds from Germany into controlled accounts to finance the operation. The German payments increased progressively as the fictitious network seemed to grow in size and productivity. The sheer volume of information sent by Garbo had a direct impact on the German strategy. The Abwehr stopped trying to infiltrate additional agents into the United Kingdom from the end of 1943, considering that it already had a sufficiently effective source. However, not all difficulties were related to operational work. The private life of the family faced obstacles stemming from the conditions of the service. Due to security demands, Araceli had limited contact with outside people and did not participate in social activities. This prolonged isolation generated domestic tensions that had to be managed without compromising the operation. MI5 took administrative measures to stabilize the situation, facilitating restricted shopping, providing logistical support, and conducting regular visits aimed at supervising the family's well-being. These actions were part of the operational environment needed to maintain the continuity of Garbo's work. By the end of 1943, the operation reached its maturity. The fictitious network was consolidated, transmissions were regularly carried out, and the Abwehr fully trusted Garbo. During that same period, the 20 Committee began planning disinformation operations aimed at influencing the German perception of a possible Allied landing in France. The double-cross system would play a fundamental role in this process, and Garbo would be a central piece in building the narrative designed to divert German attention from the true point of invasion, the hidden signal, the operation that caught the German High Command. By the end of 1943, the operating system built around Garbo had reached a level of stability that allowed MI5 to plan more extensive operations using its fictitious network. During that period, the 20 Committee reviewed the reports received from the Abwehr through radio interceptions and concluded that the credibility of Arabelle, the German codename for Juan Pujol, was firmly established. The network, composed of 27 fictitious identities, remained active in German documentation, generated constant traffic, and absorbed a significant portion of the analytical time of intelligence officers in Madrid and Berlin. The frequency of German inquiries to Garbo, as well as the progressive increase of payments sent through Lisbon, showed that the Abwehr considered the information from its agent in London indispensable. With the structure already established, MI5 retrospectively reviewed an episode that occurred 1 year earlier during the preparation of Operation Torch in order to use it as a basis for future deception maneuvers. At that time, in early November of 1942, Pujol had drafted a detailed report on a convoy that departed from the Clyde bound for North Africa. This report, written with British instructions and deliberately withheld before being sent, reached the Abwehr on the 9th of November, when Allied forces had already landed in Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca. The letter, dated before the attack but sent afterwards, had reinforced the image of Arabelle as a diligent agent operating under the natural limitations of airmail in wartime. The analysis by the 20 Committee at the end of 1943 showed that this episode continued to influence the German evaluation of the network's reliability. The experience with Torch demonstrated that the combination of authentic data and controlled delays could increase German confidence without jeopardizing military operations. The knowledge of this reaction became a useful precedent when the Allied High Command began the final planning of Operation Overlord. Starting from January of 1944, the Abwehr requested Garbo for intensive surveillance on troop movements, material build-up, and exercises that could anticipate a large-scale offensive in Western Europe. The increase in these requests reflected that Berlin considered a landing imminent. In parallel, the Allies were finalizing a strategic deception program designed to manipulate German perception about the location of the invasion. This program, called Operation Fortitude, was divided into two components. Fortitude. North simulated preparations in Scotland intended for an invasion of Norway. Fortitude South created the illusion that the main force was in the southeast of England, ready to cross the Strait of Calais. The overall objective was to induce Germany to distribute its defensive capability at incorrect points, thus reducing the concentration of forces in Normandy. In the early stage of 1944, the British completed the creation of the first United States Army Group, FUSAG, a non-existent formation composed in Allied documents by numerous divisions endowed with fictitious administrative structures. To give greater credibility to the whole, General George S. Patton was nominally assigned as commander. Photographs, simulated movements, and indirect references were part of the set of visual and auditory signals aimed at active German agents or potential observers. However, the visual component had a limited scope. The Luftwaffe could no longer carry out deep reconnaissance flights over the United Kingdom due to Allied air supremacy. For that reason, most of the operational weight fell on double agents, and among them, Garbo occupied a unique position. Unlike other agents, his fictitious network provided multiple independent sources, each with its own professional history, area of observation, and communication pattern. This allowed for the generation of reports that simulated coming from diverse sectors: ports, industrial areas, auxiliary military units, civilian institutions, or coastal towns. During the first months of 1944, Pujol transmitted more than 500 messages by radio. The MI5 technical operator, Charles Haynes, was responsible for sending them from the operational house in Hendon. The transmissions were made in sessions coordinated with Harris, who incorporated the instructions received from the 20 Committee. The design of each message followed the logic of Fortitude. No report explicitly stated that Calais would be the invasion point, but all provided partial data that should lead to that conclusion. Among this data were sightings of divisional insignia in the Kent region, descriptions of amphibious training supposedly observed by certain subagents, references to vehicles camouflaged with Mediterranean patterns, and mentions of visits by senior American commanders. The German documentation preserved after the war confirms that the analysts of the OKW integrated information from Arabelle into their final evaluations. The reports associated with Garbo were cited in several weekly summaries, especially those related to troop movements in the south of England. The presence of Patton in certain parts of the country, carefully coordinated by the British, reinforced the interpretation that the general was in command of an invasion force located opposite the Pas de Calais. On the 5th of June 1944, a few hours before the start of Overlord, Pujol sent a message requesting that the German station remain operational beyond the usual schedule. He indicated that one of his fictitious subagents might have relevant information. Although this request was designed to prepare the ground for a subsequent message, the operators in Madrid closed the station at the usual time. At 3 in the morning on the 6th of June, Pujol began to transmit details related to the distribution of rations and equipment in the Allied camps. This data suggested preparatory activities for a significant military movement. Not receiving an immediate response, he continued transmitting for several hours. At 6:30 in the morning, Allied forces began landings on the beaches of Normandy. The initial impact allowed consolidation of beachheads at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Abwehr operators resumed communication around 8 o'clock and received the transmissions that Garbo had sent during the early morning hours. Although the information they received described events already in progress, the Abwehr considered it consistent with the situation and useful for interpreting the magnitude of the offensive. On June 9th, Garbo sent a particularly significant message. In it, he presented a supposed analysis based on the joint work of the fictitious subagents. That analysis estimated the existence of 75 Allied divisions prepared for an invasion in 2 phases. The first phase, according to the message, had already begun in Normandy. The second, which would constitute the main attack, would take place at the Pas de Calais. This message was classified as urgent and relayed to Berlin. German documents show that the information was incorporated directly into the High Command summaries. The immediate operational consequence was the retention of numerous divisions in the Calais region. Subsequent reports indicate that 2 armoured divisions and 19 infantry divisions remained immobile for weeks after the landing. This decision limited the German capacity to reinforce Normandy quickly. The duration of this retention far exceeded the expectations of the Allied planners, who anticipated an effective deception for an approximate period of 2 weeks. In reality, the retention was prolonged for more than 7, which facilitated the establishment of the necessary logistics for the expansion of the beachhead. As the campaign continued on the continent, the Abwehr informed Garbo on the 29th of July, 1944, that he had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in recognition of the information provided. This decoration was added to the British recognition received months later, when Juan Pujol was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire. Both events were documented in official records. In the summer of 1944, MI5 once again used Garbo to influence German operations. After the start of the V-1 missile attacks against London, the Double Cross system decided to employ double agents to manipulate the impact reports. Garbo transmitted locations slightly shifted to the north and west, which led the Abwehr to recommend adjustments in the trajectories. As a result, several missiles fell in less densely populated areas. By the end of 1944, the need for deception operations had decreased. The Allied forces were advancing rapidly through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The German military collapse on multiple fronts reduced the strategic utility of maintaining long-range fictitious networks. At the beginning of 1945, MI5 ordered the progressive decrease of activity related to Arabelle. Despite this, the network officially remained active until the last months of the war, leveraging the accumulated credibility to manage residual information until the final collapse of the Third Reich. At this point, the operation developed around Garbo had demonstrated that a fictitious network could keep the intelligence apparatus of a military power deceived for a prolonged period, even during decisive operations. The work carried out from Hendon between 1943 and 1944 would later serve as a reference in studies on military disinformation and strategic intelligence control. With the end of the war near, a new stage was beginning for Pujol, a stage marked by decisions that would affect his life after the conflict. Silent ending, the construction of a second life. In 1949, 4 years after the end of the Second World War, Juan Pujol Garcia was outside the active British intelligence circuit. MI5 had progressively reduced its focus on the Arabelle network after the German defeat and had reassigned resources towards post-war tasks. During that period, Pujol maintained occasional communication with former officers, especially with Thomas Harris. In 1948, he requested assistance to establish a new identity abroad. The request was analysed internally for security reasons. Some officers believed that, after the fall of the Third Reich, the risk was limited. However, there were reports about former members of the Abwehr who had emigrated to various countries through clandestine networks. These reports, along with Pujol's desire to avoid any connection with his operative past, prompted MI5 to authorize the creation of documentation that certified a fictitious death. At the beginning of 1949, an administrative file was prepared reporting that Juan Pujol Garcia had died of malaria in Angola. The communication was transmitted through British diplomatic channels. The Spanish authorities received the notice and officially recorded it. The information also reached his family in Madrid, who had been separated from him since the end of the war. Once his death was formalized in the Spanish records, Pujol left Africa and traveled to Latin America under a different identity. His final destination was Venezuela, a country that at that moment was experiencing a strong industrial expansion due to the development of the oil industry. In May of 1949, Pujol settled in Lagunillas, a town linked to oil exploitation in the west of the country. The presence of foreigners was common due to the hiring of European and American technicians by multinational companies dedicated to the energy sector. In that environment, a Spanish citizen could integrate without significant administrative difficulties. Pujol obtained a job as a language instructor for a company linked to the industry, a role he performed by teaching Spanish and English to workers who required basic language training to operate in multinational environments. During the first years in Venezuela, Pujol led a low-profile life. Later, he opened a small business dedicated to the sale of stationery, gifts, and school supplies. The business operated with an informal credit system for local workers. The activity responded to the demand generated by the area's demographic growth and the presence of families linked to the oil sector. In 1954, he entered into a civil marriage with Carmen Cilia, a Venezuelan residing in the region. The couple had 3 children, Carlos Miguel, Juan Carlos, and Maria Elena. The family alternated residence between Lagunillas and other localities, including Caracas, depending on the economic situation of each period. In the mid-1950s and during the 1960s, Pujol attempted to undertake additional business projects. Among them, he established a bookstore, a small supply store, and a tourism business in Choroní, a coastal town in the state of Aragua. Choroní, located within the Henri Pittier National Park, had natural landscapes that allowed for initiatives oriented towards incipient tourism. Pujol opened an inn called Maricel. The project included accommodation activities and basic services for visitors to the area. However, infrastructure limitations and the lack of sufficient capital hindered the sustainability of the inn, which closed after a few years. In the family sphere, the separation of Pujol and Araceli, his first wife, had been formalized after the war. The official information about his death in Angola reached Spain in 1949, and Araceli was registered as a widow. She later married an American citizen and settled with her children in Madrid. The communication between Pujol and his Spanish family was completely interrupted due to the conditions of his new identity and the security restrictions he himself had requested. Starting in the 1960s, Pujol resided permanently in Venezuela, mainly in localities in the center and west of the country. He worked in small businesses and maintained a limited social life. The occasional references he made to his activity during the Second World War were presented without operational details. In a context where it was common to find European emigrants in Venezuela with diverse backgrounds, these mentions did not arouse much interest. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, certain documents related to the double-cross system began to be progressively declassified. In the early 1970s, the British writer and researcher Rupert Allison, known professionally as Nigel West, started an investigation on Garbo. His work included interviews with retired officers and reviews of files already available. Although several sources mentioned the double agent, the full identity was not explicitly present in the documents available to the public. Among the references found by West was a partial name indirectly provided by Anthony Blunt, art historian and former officer linked to the British services. Blunt mentioned that the agent was named Juan or José Garcia. Due to the commonness of the last name, the information was not conclusive. West's investigation progressed slowly for more than a decade. The accessible files confirmed the existence of the agent, but not his civil identity nor his current whereabouts. In March of 1984, West finally obtained the full name through a former MI5 officer who had worked in Spain during the war. With that information, he began a systematic search for relatives in Barcelona. After multiple calls, a contact admitted to being a related in-law of Pujol and provided a reference that allowed him to locate one of his sons. In this way, West discovered that Juan Pujol Garcia had not died in 1949 and was living in Venezuela. At the end of April of 1984, West contacted Caracas through a telephone call directed to the residence where one of Pujol's sons lived. The communication was attended to by Pujol himself, who confirmed his identity during the conversation. After an initial exchange, they agreed to a meeting in New Orleans on the 20th of May of that same year. The objective was to conduct an extensive interview and assess the possibility of publicly documenting the story of Garbo. The meeting was held as planned. For several hours, West gathered information about Pujol's operational trajectory, the dynamics of the double-cross system, and activities related to the Arabelle network. After the meeting, there was an agreement on the joint preparation of a biographical work that would include the material available in British archives and Pujol's testimony. This project materialized in the book Operation Garbo, published in 1985. Following the public reappearance of Pujol, several British media outlets published his story. In June of 1984, the Mail on Sunday published a report on his identity accompanied by current photographs. The media interest extended to other newspapers and television networks. In the United Kingdom, Pujol was invited to participate in interviews and commemorative events for D-Day. The British authorities facilitated visits to institutions related to his former work, such as the Special Forces Club, where he met with former intelligence officers who had worked during the war. In the context of the 40th anniversary of the Normandy landing, he was invited to participate in commemorative events on the French beaches. During those visits, meetings were held with veterans of the operation who had been deployed in the areas where Overlord took place. Pujol toured sectors such as Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno and Sword, accompanied by civil and military authorities. A significant consequence of his reappearance was the restoration of contact with his children from the first marriage. After obtaining confirmation of his identity, meetings were organized between them. Although there were decades of separation, the reappearance allowed, at least, the establishment of basic family communications and the closing of the stage of uncertainty regarding his whereabouts. After the public events of 1984 and the publication of the joint work with West in 1985, Pujol returned to Venezuela. His health was fragile due to his age and various medical complications. He summed up his life in domestic activities, family gatherings, and occasional contacts with researchers interested in the double-cross system. Media attention progressively diminished during those years. On the 10th of October of 1988, Juan Pujol Garcia passed away in Caracas at the age of 76. After the corresponding procedures, his body was transferred to Choroni, a Venezuelan locality where he had resided and where he had attempted to establish commercial activities decades earlier. He was buried in the local cemetery, within the area corresponding to the Henri Pittier National Park. The grave contains a basic inscription with his dates of birth and death. Next to his resting place are those of his second wife and his daughter, who passed away in 1975. Pujol's career continued to be a subject of study after his death. British documents declassified in the following decades confirmed in detail the central role he played in the double-cross system and in Operation Fortitude. Military analyses underlined the importance of his contribution to holding German divisions in Calais, a factor that allowed the Allied forces to consolidate the beachhead in Normandy. His reappearance in 1984 allowed for the completion of documentation that had remained incomplete until then, especially in relation to the closing of his life after the war. By the end of the 20th century, the figure of Juan Pujol Garcia was integrated into academic studies, biographies, and strategic analyses related to Allied military intelligence. His role is considered a reference case to illustrate the construction and exploitation of fictitious networks in deception operations. The use of partial information, the management of consistent narratives, and the coordination among multiple agencies constitute key elements analyzed in the corresponding historiography. His later life in Venezuela continues to be an example of civil reconstruction after a prolonged undercover activity.